so incredibly obvious that the killing of Israeli civilians, the deliberate killing of Israeli civilians by Hamas, is a crime against humanity, and that the forced, coerced use of Palestinian civilians as human shields from which to launch attacks against human civilians is likewise a crime by Hamas against the Palestinian people. Let's face it, if you are a Palestinian living in Gaza, criticizing Hamas for murdering Israeli civilians and for inflicting needless suffering on Gazans is not a particularly smart career move. When Hamas expelled its political opponents from Gaza in 2007, it murdered several hundred of those political opponents, as I know Amnesty knows, including by throwing them off rooftops, both to silence them and to send what was not an subtle to others about what happens when you challenge Hamas. And during the Gaza war, Hamas murdered dozens more of its political opponents, pronouncing them collaborators with Israel. Not everyone was so unlucky. There were some people who were relatively lucky. They were merely kneecapped, that is to say, shot in the knees for the purpose of crippling them and sending a message to others. So it is small wonder why in Gaza there is silence about the killing of Israeli civilians, the forcible use of Palestinian civilians as human shields, the exhortation on the part of Palestinians for other Palestinians to kill people of another faith, the use of children not merely as combatants in violation of God knows how many human rights protocols, but actually as human bombs, or the murder or the kneecapping of Hamas's opponents. So it's understandable that there is the silence in Gaza. But what about Palestinians who do not live in Gaza? What is it that we should conclude about their silence in the face of these appalling human rights violations on the part of Hamas and Islamic Jihad? My hope is, my expectation is, that we can talk about the claims of disproportional force, the use of phosphorus smoke bombs, and the other accusations that have been made. And we can discuss the reason why Colonel Richard Kemp, a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, who would be in a position to know, gave this assessment to the BBC of Israel's performance during Gaza. Quote, "I don't think there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when an army has made more efforts to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza." But I want to, unquote, but I want to conclude with this observation. The dreadful poverty in Gaza is a terrible fact which badly needs to be addressed. It's, of course, a situation which has existed for decades. It existed when Egypt controlled Gaza. It existed before Israel came to have any presence in Gaza as a result of the '67 war, and it exists now. It is a situation which has gotten much worse. It's gotten much worse, unfortunately, since the Palestinian leadership rejected an independent Palestinian state in all of Gaza, virtually all the West Bank with a capital in East Jerusalem in 2000, and it has certainly gotten worse since Hamas expelled its political opponents in 2007. One of the reasons it has gotten worse is that Arab states that have ample petrodollars to invest in Gaza do not wish to do so for reasons which are clear. Another reason is that Western European countries who have contributed billions of dollars of donor aid to Palestinians feel as though they have been repeatedly burned by Hamas and are disinclined to be burned again. But let us be honest. The principal reason for the impoverishment of Gazans is the Palestinian leadership itself, which has, I regret to say, a long history of effectively ripping off the people it claims to care about. And here is an illustration of the larger problem. Some of you may remember this, some of you may not. Not long before Chairman Arafat died, it emerged, thanks to the efforts of the quite courageous Palestinian finance minister, later the Palestinian prime minister, that somewhere between $1 and $3 billion of donor aid, Palestinian taxes, and UN relief intended to relieve the plight of the Palestinians had somehow found their way to bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland controlled by Chairman Arafat or those that were close to him. Now, $1 to $3 billion, pretty soon you're talking real money. It's money that would have gone a long way to improving the lives of people in Gaza. When the story first emerged, according to press reports that I read, when Chairman Arafat was asked about the $1 to $3 million and how they had managed to find their way into his bank accounts, he replied that, it really wasn't what it looked like, that there was an explanation, and the explanation was as follows. He said, this $1 to $3 billion represented savings that dated back to the time he'd been working construction in the 1950s. And those of you who, like me, at least try to put money aside for a rainy day can only join me in admiration at what a disciplined savings plan can do that results in the accumulation of $1 to $3 billion. We're frequently told about the power of compound interest if you simply begin saving soon enough and what can happen when you're that disciplined. Speaking for myself, I must say I have been trying to put money aside for over 25 years. I've had a hell of a time getting even to the $1 billion mark, let alone the $3 billion mark, but apparently it can be done. And I mention this because maintaining people in squalor and ensuring in one way or another that they stay mired in squalor, and then using them as human shields for the purpose of enabling civilians to be killed, is itself an affront to human rights, and one which needs to be scrutinized fairly and rigorously by those who hold themselves out as human rights advocates. The use of children as human bombs, the use of an entire population as human shields, the suppression of freedom of expression and the rights of women, the murder and the maiming of political opponents, the intimidation of an entire population, the infliction of Palestinian civilians of unnecessary poverty so that they can be used, literally used as propaganda tools. If there is anyone who does not care about the Palestinian leadership, the Hamas leadership, its violations of the human rights of Israelis, or the targeting, the 8,000 rockets fired with no purpose at all at Israeli civilians, surely they must care about the human rights of the Palestinians who are the victims of multiple and systematic human rights violations at the hands of their own leadership. It takes courage, if you are a Palestinian, to straightforwardly and publicly, on websites or otherwise, condemn the Hamas leadership as the serial and egregious human rights violator that it is. It takes physical courage if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank or Gaza, because you or your family run a meaningful risk of being bodily harmed if you speak up. But even for those living abroad, it takes courage, especially if you want to have any future with the Palestinian leadership, those who control the funds, those who are the political and religious leaders, those who run the Palestinian organizations, are, let us face it, unlikely to take particularly kindly to those who depart from the standard line that Israel is the oppressor and all the rest of it. And it takes courage. It takes courage, if you are not Palestinian, but you are part of the larger human rights community, to challenge the political fashion, which has become not merely trendy, but downright chic, that holds that really these Israelis have a hell of a nerve defending themselves and their civilians from rockets and bombs and mortars launched at their civilians. It isn't popular, but it needs to be done. It has to be done not merely because intellectual honesty demands it, but because the cause of human rights demands it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Omar Baddar, is currently the director of the Palestinian Cultural Center for Peace, which is located in Boston, a steering committee member of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, and a board member of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts. He earned a degree in international relations from the University of Memphis, where he wrote his master's thesis on U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Omar Baddar.
Thank you. Mr. Robbins began his remarks by pointing to the 8,000 rockets that were fired during that 8-year period. It is worth noting that roughly 20 Israelis were killed as a result of that, and that Israel killed thousands of Palestinians in Gaza during that period. In fact, it killed 10 times that 20 number in a matter of minutes during the initial invasion of Gaza. I think in terms of talking about human rights, it's always important to take a look at the broader picture. Thanks to the reports of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, we know that the sheer scale of the killing and the destruction that Israel wreaked on Gaza during